Hi, my name is Sean Siebold. I'm president of Siebold Capital Management. We're here with Dave McGowan of the DuPage Foundation. We're going to talk a little bit about charitable giving and what it means to make it a family affair. So, welcome, Dave.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate you having me.
To start, let's talk about what is a community foundation. The DuPage Foundation is a community foundation, but what in general is that and what makes them an interesting entity?
Well, a community foundation is the organization in any community, be it a municipality, county, state, or region, that's carrying the torch for charitable giving in their community. Typically, we build charitable endowments, so we have assets under management from which we make grants to benefit the community at large.
Okay. Why would people engage a community foundation? What would be the item of interest that would say, I need to talk to a community foundation?
Yeah, great question. And in our last strategic plan, we went through many conversations around what our value was to the community. And in fact, there are many different ways to define that. And the first one is just to have the opportunity to find someone to have a conversation with about the to whom, how much, when, and with what assets to make a gift. And there's so many different strategies to do that. We have the ability with our staff and volunteers and our access to advisors such as yourself to be the gatekeeper for all those conversations and the information and guiding people to the kinds of objectives they're trying to meet.
So what is if you were to name one, what is the most critical impact that a community foundation can have on its community?
Well, by our vision, and most community foundations have this, it's to raise the quality of life throughout their community. Well, that's a pretty global goal. When you peel back a couple layers, it's really to take initiatives that will benefit the community. For example, in our case, we focus on early childhood care and education as one of our initiatives. We've also rolled out an arts initiative. It's about providing the charitable capital to accomplish the objectives set forth, but it's also, we found out, being a convener of all the other resources out there. So I frequently will say, as a community foundation, if we're doing our job well, we're not taking any money that's already in play from individuals, companies, other organizations that are already giving. They're learned and informed grant makers themselves. But it's about teaching those individuals and organizations how to perpetuate those gifts, how to endow them, and either during lifetime outright major gifts or in their estate plans. And then it's teaching those who don't necessarily understand the joy of giving yet how to experience that joy.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so you've talked a little bit about community foundations. Let's talk specifically about the DuPage Foundation. What is its role? What is its boundaries? Because it's a community. What is its community that it serves?
Sure. By nature and by name, we are focused on DuPage County. There are community foundations throughout the state of Illinois, and there's actually about 800 of us in the United States. The movement is going global. In fact, some of the folks from the states are teaching some folks overseas how to start community foundations. But right here in DuPage, we're focused on DuPage County and connecting all those wonderful municipalities and those people. 935,000 residents. We're bigger than several states. Some of those municipalities are diverse, so we work to get everybody on the same page and working toward the same goals in the county. Our community foundation is 32 years old. We have approximately $90 million in assets from completely unrestricted funds, where individuals have given us the discretion, our board and grant committee, on where to make annual grants through our community needs program, to completely restricted funds. So we hold funds for other organizations, for example, or designated funds for specific organizations or causes.
You mentioned it a little bit earlier. I'm going to go back to that question again. DuPage Community Foundation, what is the mission of DuPage Foundation with regards to what interests that you serve?
Okay, sure. So we're a broad-based grant maker. We grant in all areas: health, human services, arts, education, environment. But in order to make a big difference, to move the needle on something, we've taken on these initiatives, as I mentioned earlier. So we got into the early childhood care and education space because we went out to the community and asked, what were the biggest needs out there? We surveyed for different organizations and individuals. And this one rose to the top. In the meantime, we also had a donor very interested in the early childhood space. When we have a willing donor and an identified need, that's the perfect scenario for the community foundation to get involved and be the central point between those resources and needs, which is really the definition of a community foundation, marrying up resources with needs. In the meantime, what we learned was that if we invest in the 0 to 5, our youth, especially at-risk youth in DuPage County, and get them all at grade level when they enter kindergarten, we'll have to make less grants when they're adults, remediation type grants for counseling, job training and placement, mental health issues. So we know that we can spend $1 in the 0 to 5 population and spend less on the other end of the equation. So it's a big undertaking because it means you're willing to invest in the future of the community, not necessarily those folks right now that need help. Doesn't mean we're not granting to help those. It just means we're having a bigger picture view on our grant making strategies.
So when you say it's an investment in the future, you're actually seeing a return on that investment.
Yeah, we're actually, our first community that we invested in, we call it Bright and Early DuPage, our early childhood care and education initiative. And that first community was Wheaton Warrenville, District 200, 6 years ago now. And we're actually seeing kindergarten readiness scores going up. And we're seeing that this collaborative of 30 plus organizations working together are having more impact collectively than they did with their individual organizations.
Wow, that's really the power of putting everything together. Excellent. Let's kind of take a little different tact here. Let's talk a little bit about charitable contributions, philanthropy with regards to the family unit. So how do you engage a family in the charitable process as opposed to an individual says, I'm just going to write a check, or I just want you to help me with this? How do you get a family of a mother, a father, children, grandchildren? How do you get them involved in that process?
As early as possible is my first response. Many people will say, oh, when my kids are a certain age, and I've seen all those numbers, and I say, pull that number down, because even our youngest family members are capable of understanding, giving, and volunteering at a very young age. You might be aware of the trend now where even kindergartners are saying, in lieu of presents to me, please make a contribution to this particular organization. When those kids are at one of the most selfish ages, they're doing one of the most selfless things. By teaching the kids that opportunity, even at that young age, that's a lesson that will carry through their adult lives as well. So whatever that is, pull that age down that you think you will teach your kids philanthropy, because they're going to have capacity much sooner than you think. Gosh, this is my favorite part of the day, is working with families and understanding that intergenerational philanthropy lesson. I grew up here in DuPage with my dad taking me to wheelchair basketball games at George Williams College and volunteering there. We were encouraged to do the 30-mile hunger marches in DuPage. We were always doing something. My parents and grandparents were always involved in something. So surprise, I'm heading up the local community foundation, helping others do the same. It's absolutely, in faith and family formation, an opportunity to teach at a very young age and get folks involved. So some of the specific strategies, no matter what I've said about how young, it's never too late either. But, for example, we've had any number of grandparents who want to set up a family fund with us, and they're going to do it at end of life with assets when they're done with it. Makes total sense. But what I say to them is, you can do the handoff, and we'll do the handoff for you when we receive your assets and teach your family what your intentions were. But if you have the capacity to carve out even a piece of that deferred gift and put it in play now and get your family around the table with you, not us, the lesson will be that much more meaningful to them. So there's so many ways to do this. It's part of the most fascinating part of the job, and people will rise to the occasion. We had one couple that was struggling with their young adult children getting involved, and they were trying to motivate them. And I said, okay, well, let's try this with your donor advised fund. For Christmas, give each of them a gift certificate worth $1,000 to make a grant recommendation out of this family fund. And so we're always looking at creative ways to engage those families in that.
You've talked a lot about the pros of how to get the family involved. Why? I mean, it's great in terms of, you're instilling a culture. Talk to me about Are there any cons to getting families involved? Is there anything that makes it harder or hard to do that people should kind of think about?
Well, if there are some outside of philanthropy tensions or connections that aren't quite solid within a family, it might be hard to get them all rallied around a collective pool of charitable dollars. In that case, we've had some families where we have a donor-advised fund, we have a couple that started the fund, but the 3 adult children and their spouses each have their own pot from which to grant. That's just recognizing that there might not be natural connections, or the con being that they don't all have the same charitable interests. So they're not going to collectively decide on different organizations. So recognizing that and giving them each their own piece of that family philanthropy is perfectly fine. It recognizes the dynamic of the family.
So the dynamics of a family could be family-based charities, or they could be individual-based charities through a family pot. I think that's a little bit what you're kind of saying in terms of the pros and the cons.
It is. So, and even for any family, challenges or not, understanding the options. So if a couple has charitable intent, there's nothing saying they can't just make outright gifts and bequests directly to a certain number of organizations. Absolutely, they're privileged to do so. They can set up a private foundation. They can do a donor-advised fund at their local community foundation, or they can do some kind of a trust, or particularly a charitable trust, to do the grant making, or they can set up a number of those vehicles, as I suggest.
What tools can the DuPage Foundation utilize in helping families make gifts efficiently that achieve all the goals that your clients need?
When given the opportunity to sit down with a couple and/or their family, that's the perfect scenario where we have FaceTime, where we can sit down and let them tell us who they are, what experiences have they had, what board roles, what volunteer roles, and what giving have they done so far. Most of that, if they're having that conversation, has been what we call transactional in nature. Now we're looking at transformational giving, and usually it has to do with some form of perpetuity. They're looking at how do we ingrain this in the family, how do we leave this legacy for future generations, not only on the grant-making side, but so that those dollars are there to help in perpetuity for those particular organizations or causes.
Talk a little bit about a donor-advised fund. What does that do? What does that mean? What characteristics of a donor-advised fund can be used and should be used for giving? Sure,
and it is the go-to because it's the fastest growing niche of philanthropy in this country, for sure. I've been in the field for a number of years, and to see now some of the donor-advised funds top the charts of largest charities in our country means that the whole way people give has changed. And now I'd like to circle back and say, but it's one tool. I mean, there's charitable remainder trusts with using irrevocable life insurance trust to leverage assets to still leave a legacy for family and put charitable dollars in play. Now we have a permanent provision for rollover gifts from your IRA. That's we worked for a couple decades to get that as a permanent provision. Again, direct giving, private foundation, there's so many ways, and really at that point, the family should be sitting down with professionals such as yourself to look at what's the best financial way to do that, what's the best tax advantaged way to do that. But circling back to donor advised, it's the easiest way to set up an organized philanthropy for an individual, a family, or an organization. I did one the Friday before New Year's in one day. Literally in one day. If it's not complex, we have the template for the agreement to set up the fund and transfer the assets, and it's that easy to do. So, and it doesn't require any fees. It doesn't require any other professionals other than those on the donor advised team staff. You've been in the business for a few years. Could you tell me a little bit about how family giving has changed? Has it? Are the tools being utilized? Have they changed? So what kind of trends are you seeing over the last, say, 10 years or so? Is there anything meaningful that you could kind of talk to? Well, we have multiple generations in the philanthropic scene these days, so each one is approaching it a little differently. Those senior folks are still the loyal donors. They're giving every year to a very short list of the same organizations. And making those investments based on their history with those organizations. The younger that you get, the more due diligence is being performed. The more each year, there will be no assumption of renewal. You will earn my gift, you will earn my time, and please don't have everything answered before I come to the table, because I want to be part of the solution. If all you're really asking me for is a check, I'm going to find that less satisfying than you asking me to be at the table solving some of these societal issues. So it just depends on where folks fall on that continuum, in particular with age. Other trends I'm seeing probably include the timing of a gift with the life expectancies growing. My wife and I just sat down and we're told that I could live till 94 and she could live till 96. That's a little humbling, but it also says, gee, I may need those assets during my lifetime. So I think you're going to see less outright major gifts from the 70-and-a-half-year-old folks till their estates. I think you'll see more assets out of estates than during lifetime for those folks, because they're not sure what their investment returns will look like and how long they'll need to use those assets. I think that's trending as well. One trend I want to make note of, the population boon after the war, the folks that will turn 80 in their 80s will peak in 2028, where the second to die in a family, the estate will change hands. Right now, about 6% of estates change hands, change generations in this country. That'll peak out at 14% in 2028, and then come back down to level off at 9 or 10%. What that says for not-for-profits is they have a decade to have some really meaningful conversations with their annual donors about leaving a bequest. It's probably the biggest window of opportunity we've had. For you as financial advisors, same thing. Your clients who will have that opportunity want you to challenge them with where and how, and this is the probably the biggest window of opportunity for capturing wealth out of an estate that we probably will ever see in this country.
So planned giving is clearly becoming more important in today's world. Is there an opportunity there to get the family engaged more, or does that cause a little bit more friction in that engagement process?
Definitely opportunity to engage more. And many families that are starting to do planning are engaging their children in a way that didn't happen before. There was more information just in general about finances and where things are and how we want this to work. There's just a lot more open communication, sometimes not at the welcome nature of the next generation. I don't want to talk about that, but we will. I want you to be learned and informed about what the goals are here.
You talked about generation in terms of how that giving. What we find as we work with clients is that the next generation doesn't really expect it because of the way people are living. I mean, you're not going to have a 70 or 80-year-old matriarch, patriarch giving their money to a 60-year-old child if they have children young. So is there an opportunity there to engage not just the children, but the children's children? And how would we have that process?
Sure. Skip the generation. There's generation skipping strategies in financial affairs. Why not in charitable affairs as well? There's every opportunity for grandparents and grandchildren to connect directly. Definitely see that opportunity.
We see a difference and you mentioned it a little bit ago, but we see a difference in the generations in terms of how they're getting involved. So you have the baby boomers, you have their children, now we have millennials. Millennials seem to be engaged more in community events and more engaged in what's going on around them in charitable causes. They volunteer more. Is there an opportunity to engage them at a younger age in the giving process, rather than the traditional strategy of go out, get a job, earn wealth, and then talk about it later?
Yeah, it'll definitely be woven through their lifetimes rather than something you do when you get to a stage in life. You're definitely zeroing in on something really particularly important to them. It'll be something woven through their work and personal lives for sure. And advocating more too, not just the involvement, the volunteer involvement and the finance. They're also going to be advocates, as we're seeing in the national scene today. There'll be a lot more voice that comes with the money and the time.
We changed gears a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about private foundations and how they can integrate with an organization like yours.
Well, we have some private foundations that work with us to do some of their local community-based giving. We've had 3 private foundations that were formed for a particular reason and with a particular set of people and circumstances that changed. And then they did a private foundation dissolution into a donor-advised fund. In fact, last year, a local family foundation, the Gustafson Family Foundation, folded its $17 million foundation into our community foundation last June. Circumstances changed for the family. They had different charitable interests because of a triggering event in their family. So they knew that the energy was shifting, but to respect the family philanthropy, they put it with us for caretaking and coaching and nurturing so that the family didn't have to worry about the administration or the mechanics of operating the fund, and it gave them the peace of mind that they were okay changing focus on a new direction. Private foundations in the beginning, as we say these conversations, if there's not a substantial amount of assets or a long-term strategy, I'm going to look at carefully with those families about, is this really the right vehicle? There's cost, time on the front end, and then on an annual basis, there's responsibilities for making sure all those filings take place. There's rules and regulations about what you can grant, when there's just so many rules. Why not remove all that in a donor-advised platform and only have to focus on the grant-making part of it? So, again, it just depends on each set of circumstances, and they can change over time.
So great. Let's really shift gears. Tax change. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2018 was implemented. How will that? It has impacted some deductions. It seems to have some impact on. Perhaps the tax deductibility of some charitable contributions. How do you see that changing? Have you heard any impacts? And what would how are you going to handle that change in the tax code?
Yeah, excellent question, Sean. We saw it firsthand in 2017 with the market up and the unknown circumstances in taxes for this year at the time. We had a lot of year-end giving. In fact, we had donor-advised funds open just to be able to front load some gifts, not knowing what would happen this year and going forward. In fact, we had a couple donors give us a couple years worth of gifts just because they didn't want to, take the chance of not being able to deduct this year's, if you will. Here's where I stand on this. Over time, no matter what the tax provisions, people start with a transformational gift based on passion and emotion. It's what brings them to the table to talk about it. Then the rational piece of the brain takes over. How am I going to do this? What's the most tax advantaged way? And they seek out counsel from folks. But at the end of the day, when they make the gift, it's back to the emotion. I want to make a difference. This makes me angry in our community. This gives me joy. And that's when they make the gift. Now, in that middle piece, it does matter. The timing, the amount, usually the tax can influence that. But when I'm talking with families, I try to actually stay focused on both of those ends of the equation because that's what they really want to do. And so, I try not to let the tax piece get in the way of them accomplishing something because at the end of the day, it's really not going to be the biggest factor that, and most of the families that are talking about a gift like that have the capacity to take care of whatever tax provisions. Now, That said, we won't know what the outcome will be. Last year, we had almost $400 billion estimated to be given in this country. It was up about 2.5% over the prior year. We'll just have to see how this year plays out to see what implications the changes have had. It's going to be interesting to see the standard deduction. I mean, but every time you look at one of those, the con, you look at the pro, there's more discretionary income for many people, so there's more opportunity to give. I'm just not sure how it's all going to play out. We'll have to see.
I was going to say, in our practice, it's very rare that we have the discussion about taxes prior to I want to make a gift. It starts out with, this is a very good cause. This is something I want to do because it's the right thing to do.
Right.
And then the discussion is, what's the most efficient way? If it's not great, that's okay too, but we're trying to get something done.
Sure. And sometimes the CPA will actually be an originator of the conversation, but then he or she's usually out of the equation. They'll just say, hey, you're going to have some, a tax liability this year you may want to offset. But that's, sometimes as far as they'll go. But when that seed gets planted, that's when they come to the planners and say, okay, so what does this mean? We also will get into the conversation when there's charitable intent to say, hey, time out. Why don't you look at this tax event and look at it a different way? Most times it's because there's low basis property there's some transaction around that. Well, give us a piece of that low basis property. Do it before the sale, because you can avoid the capital gains. That's you want to talk about the ability to do tax avoidance, that one's left on the table frequently. When we get a large check, I have mixed emotions. I have that joy that I feel every time, but then I think, was there another way you could have done this gift? It's a tough one. We try to educate as best we can to let people know, use appreciated property during lifetime.
Yes, we try to get people to seek a professional. Let's talk about the long-term vision of DuPage Foundation. Where do you want to be in 5 years? Do you have a vision that you can communicate to those out there looking at the DuPage Foundation? How should I engage? This is where they're going, and I want to be part of that ride.
Wow, that's a great question. We're just finishing our last strategic plan. We're kicking off our next one at a retreat in April. But I can tell you what I've heard throughout the organization so far, and what I know to be from the board and staff. And that is that the gimme in a community foundation is, of course, we want to increase our assets. There is talk of us hanging our hat on growing from 100 million to 200 million in 5 years. That's a big undertaking, but we did a little research on some of our 5-year incremental growth, and it is statistically possible. We've also built a huge number of relationships that could make that happen. So that's the first gimme in a community foundation world, is grow your assets. But in the meantime, every day that we show up to work, we're doing something impactful and meaningful to move an issue forward, to help organizations do what they do, to help donors come into play. So I don't want to discount that we're always looking so far in the future that we're not recognizing what we're doing today to make a difference and to solve issues. Again, some of the stuff that will never show up on a balance sheet like the assets will is all the connectivity that we're doing. It's the non-financial interactions that we have with organizations and individuals that may never show up on a financial statement. It's also then digging into those initiatives that we're working on. I would love to say that every community in DuPage within 5 years is participating in our Bright and Early DuPage initiative, that we have the resources to be able to sustain funding for all those communities, and that they have found other funding to sustain it. I was just told by our vice president for programs that she's letting our board know next week that we've leveraged $3.2 million new dollars into DuPage for early childhood care and education spots from government sources. And DuPage is historically not looked at as a place that needs those dollars, so that's a big win for us as well. It's also looking at Arts DuPage and making sure that we have our thriving arts community recognized, invested in, that the business community understands what an investment it is to have a healthy arts community. And then it's having our antenna up to look at what is our next opportunity. The board is challenging us to say, okay, so if there's an opportunity for us to tackle another issue, what would that look like? It's somewhat overwhelming to think about taking on another one right now, but they're absolutely right that by the time we identify one, pour resources around it and move forward, one of those other initiatives will become more self-sustaining. So there's a lot of opportunity here to make a difference.
How does one find the DuPage Foundation? How do we contact you? How do we engage with you?
I'll start with our website. DuPageFoundation.org is certainly the first place to go. There's lots of resources around the to whom, how much, when, and with what assets. We also have a section on our page about professional advisors such as yourself who folks can go to have those conversations. We encourage them to do that. But the advantage of your local community foundation is that there's some really fine, talented folks who are at the ready to have a personal conversation with you. And that's our biggest advantage. When you asked earlier about our role and our value, our biggest value is we have people who grew up here, that live here, that know this community, who have experience in charitable giving and can have and be very accessible to you for those conversations.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. You've been listening to a conversation with Sean Siebold, Siebold Capital Management, and David McGowan, Executive Director of the DuPage Foundation. Thanks for watching.